What would you do if you won the lotto?
Firstly, I would quit my job and then I'd probably give some to my parents and then I'd go travelling for about 3 years.
If I won the lotto, I would fund my whole family for the rest of their life. Everything that they needed.
If I won the lotto, I would not tell my parents. I'd
probably buy a house.
How on earth would you win $10 million and have your parents not find out?
Good question.
Yeah, bro, I didn't think that far ahead.
If I won the lotto, finish off on all my tats and then go back to NZ and buy my house that I lived in for about 16 years.
Probably travel the world, see as much as I can of it.
Shoes, clothes, and travelling.
Travel the world. I'd make some mad vlogs, I'd make some mad videos, and I'd probably share a little percentage of it with some close mates.
First, I'd buy my old school, rip it up to shreds, because it has a bunch of acreage, and make at least a good 30 to 40 houses, and just invest in that and rent them out and make my money back.
There's some geniuses in that group, aren't there? What would you do? What would you do if you had arrived? That's pretty much the crux of the question in the interview, isn't it? What would you do with yourself, with your lot, with your $10 million if you had made it? And in our passage today, in verse 1, the king had finally arrived. He looks around and, my goodness, he's no longer hiding in a cave. He's not on the run. He's not in some sort of conflict anymore. He's finally settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him peace from his enemies. Now, if you've been following the story with us, that's never happened before. It's been conquest after conquest, lots of retreats, lots of setbacks, way back in the book of the Judges when the people of Israel lacked faith. They were never quite there yet. And this is perhaps the first breathing space since as far back as the Garden of Eden, where God's people are finally experiencing God's rest. And God's king now gets to do kingly things like pace around his palace, thinking about what to do next. And for us, for the readers of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, we should have expected this, shouldn't we? King David was anointed king back in 1 Samuel 16, when he was just a ruddy young lad. But that was 23 chapters ago. He was a shepherd boy, and the prophet Samuel, who has long since passed away, came to his father's house looking for the king that Yahweh had in mind. It has taken years, hasn't it, before he finally arrived. Years of suffering, of homelessness, of persecution, of loneliness. But now, God had given David rest. But unlike the young people up there that we watched from who were, I think they were holidaying in Surfers Paradise. Did anyone else notice that? Yeah, that was Cavill Avenue. Unlike those young people, David was restless in his rest, wasn't he? He was restless about God's honor. In verse 2, David said, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." That just didn't sit well with him. Now, it's a good reason to be discontent, isn't it? He doesn't say, "I deserve this, I have arrived, but that's because I've been waiting on you, God, for so long." And a lesser king might have started to build a country estate. He might have started his building project, monuments up all around of himself, or maybe financing his private island, or amassing a fine collection of chariots. I don't know. But this is a noble desire of David, to want to upgrade Yahweh's dwellings, to make it permanent, so that Israel can continue worshipping Yahweh during peacetime. Well, as the story goes, it doesn't work out that way, hey? And Chris said last week that the Lord whom we worship is not a God of our imaginations, right? He is totally and wholly other. He has a mind of his own. And sometimes in a frightening way, he reminds us of that when Uzzah tried to reach over to the ark and a tragedy ensued. We might think that building him a grand structure is a fair way to honour him, but as the Lord keeps reminding us, his thoughts are not our thoughts, and his ways are much higher than our ways. On Mother's Day, a little fact sheet came home from Drummond Park Preschool. It was entitled All About My Mum, and according to the 3-year-old Xander May, my job was to work with Daddy. My favourite food is mushrooms. My favourite way of relaxing is lying down on my bed. And my favourite drink is coffee. Now that's a cute attempt, but if I'm 100% honest, he hasn't got me right at all. My job isn't to work with Daddy, although that's a cute way of, thinking about it. Mushroom is not even on the top 10 of my favourite food. Like, where did he get that from? I can think of many better ways of relaxing, like lying on a beach, lying in the bath, just not my bed. Lying on a hotel bed maybe, that would be even better. And my favourite drink is not coffee. I just drink coffee for survival. Now, that is the level of oblivious unawareness between a child and his mum. Although he observes me, although he lives with me, he has limited knowledge and experience, and as yet, as a 3-year-old, he's not up to comprehending me, is he? Now, take that analogy and apply it to the galactic gap between any human being and his maker, between a finite creature and the holy, uncaused, eternal one. To understand what would please me, Xander would really have to listen to me, wouldn't he? He'd have to ask me. He'd have to spend time with me. He'd really have to watch and engage instead of just assuming that my favourite food is mushroom because I said yum about mushrooms once. To understand the Lord of the universe, similarly, well, we'd have to listen to him, right? And he would have to reveal himself to us. The great thing is, we know this about the Lord. He does reveal himself to us. He's not a silent God. He's a speaking God. And he's desired to be known all the way since back in the garden when he would come down and walk with the man and the woman in the cool of the day. So, it's no surprise that a big divine speech follows. There hasn't been a speech this long and this detailed since Moses met with the Lord on Mount Sinai. This is how it goes. Verse 5, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" There you go. The king, he had a good heart, but the king was, well, a bit off, wasn't he? The Lord's message is basically, thanks for thinking of me, but no thanks. When have I ever told you that I wanted one? David had to take no for an answer. How would you take no for an answer? Maybe let's reflect on it to see if it might help. We, as embodied creatures, we seem to derive a lot of significance from a place of our own, don't we? We can be really bowled over by a fancy house or by nice surroundings to be in. But to God, a house just doesn't really cut it. Oh, he had a tent, but that was for Israel's benefit. That came out of his desire to be among his people so that they might know that his presence was with them. But Yahweh, in himself, he is free. He's spirit. He's totally other. And elsewhere it says the whole earth is his. A cedar palace, that would have been the most amazing structure in Israel at that time. It would have been like St. Pat's, right? On South Hill, just looking down onto the whole town. But God didn't care for it. From his vantage point, it probably looked like a little Monopoly house. God isn't excited about real estate, not the way that we are. He's not excited about stuff. What's important to him? We really would have to listen to him then, wouldn't we? Keep an ear out as I read from verse 8. Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now, I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since at the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from your enemies. Can you hear what God is excited by? What he wants to talk about? What's important to him is relationship, his people. God says, I will provide a place for my people Israel. I will plant them. I will give them a home. I don't want them to be disturbed anymore, to be harassed all the time by enemies. I want them to be secure. I want to care for them so that they will be fruitful and multiply. We come to the final home stretch now of the passage today, and God does not stop ramping it up. Verse 11b, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. Here's the jackpot, ladies and gentlemen. You want to honor me? No. Let me honor you. Have you noticed that God is always doing that? He's always the one who outgives. David brings up the idea of a house, but God turns the idea of the house on its head, and he says, I won't just build you a building. Remember, he's interested in people, not buildings. I'm not just going to give you a building for you to live in for the rest of your life. I'm going to establish a house for you, your household, the thing that really matters, the people in your household, your family, like the House of Windsor or the House of Dior if you're into fashion. The house I will give you transcends even your own life, David. Now, those of us who have children and grandchildren can probably fully appreciate how gracious and utterly comforting such a promise is. To know that in advance, your loved ones are not only going to be just okay, they're not only just going to be looked after, not only will your line continue, but they are going to be part of an explicit promise of the promise keeper. He didn't even have to promise this, but he ramps it up. He says, not only will they be okay, their throne will endure and be established forever. Did that just come out of nowhere or what? There's even a proviso that recognizes that his descendants won't be perfect, that they will stuff up, but no amount of human stupidity or disobedience is going to thwart this promise. Can you imagine that as a grandparent going, my descendants are going to be okay and they're going to make mistakes, but they're going to be looked after. because Yahweh is going to pledge himself to these people. All I can say is, how did you get so lucky, David? And that's where our passage ends. Earlier I asked you, how well do you take no for an answer? But just as interesting is this question, I think. How well would you take this over the top, absolutely amazing, abundant, ludicrous promise of generosity? Some people would scoff. Others wouldn't be able to accept it. Their sensibilities would tell them that they are simply undeserving. I mean, why me, Lord? Why me? But there is no answer for that. That's the definition of grace, unmerited favor. So stop looking for how you merited it. When you realize that God chose you to be part of his family for no reason other than his own free choice, it leaves you in awe, doesn't it? There's just so much more to say, but I think this passage challenges us in 3 ways. Number 1, can we handle a God who is not at all our equal? That as busy as we might be, or as successful as he's allowed us to be, everything is entirely from him. Number 2, do we have the humility to really hear God's desires and his plans, and to submit to them above our own ideas, relate to him on his terms? Number 3, can we accept a relationship with a God whose nature is always to outgive and outbless us every time? That our relationship with him is not at all a quid pro quo. I do something for him and he blesses me. It's not like that. That's the message of other religions, but in Christianity, God is just the loving Father who wants to come and give to his children. Lastly, God has spoken a binding promise to the house of David, from which his love and faithfulness will never ever depart. Now, some people jump the gun and they say, well, of course I know what this is talking about. This is talking about Solomon building the Jewish temple. But I don't really think so. First, the timing's off because God is talking about a future time when David is long gone, when David is resting with his ancestors, when God will establish a lasting, eternal throne for a son of David. And remember, number 2, God's not that into buildings, is he? He's not talking about the Jewish temple. We know of a person, don't we, who fits the profile, where God will be to him the Father, and he would be God's Son. About 1,000 years later, after David, Jesus of Nazareth enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey, heralded a son of David, lapping up the people's praise, just like royalty. He was heard to say, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." He would talk about his father to the point of being labeled a blasphemer. And when asked, "Are you a king?" this was his reply, "My kingdom is not of this world." Brothers and sisters, it's Jesus. That's what I want you to see. Jesus is the King the Lord has pledged himself to, and there is no other blessing outside of Christ. He is the King finally worthy to be the royal temple builder. But he did not build a building, did he? He was referring to himself. He himself is the new temple through which true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Will you join with me as I pray? Father, thank you for your promise. It was such a huge promise that you just blew David away with. But I thank you that we're on this side of history, that we know how it ended. It ended with you installing your King, Jesus Christ, on Zion. Father, I pray that we might come to Jesus, your anointed one, that we might really acknowledge his everlasting kingship and enter the rest he has secured for us. Amen.